It is a pleasure for me to introduce our guest today, who's with us on this occasion, and of course our guest proclaimer, the Reverend Cody Sanders. Cody grew up just a few miles from here in Duncan, South Carolina, and I think he's going to say a word about familiarity with our church because he grew up so close. He's a graduate of Gardner-Webb University, majored in both religion and psychology there. He also holds a Master of Science degree in Community Counseling from Mercer University and the Master of Divinity degree from McAfee School of Theology down in Atlanta. Either because he really loves school or is a glutton for punishment. 2 master's degrees were not quite enough for him, so he is currently a doctoral student at Bright Divinity School and anticipates receiving his PhD in pastoral theology and pastoral counseling this May, just a few months. Good luck with that. Next year. Okay, next year. I thought you were a few months away. Sorry. Good luck with that. In November, around mid-November, I received an email from Paula Dempsey, who is the Minister of Partnership Relations with the Alliance. She made us aware that Cody was going to be in this area for a few days, visiting family and some other occasions, and would be available for us. So I gave him a call, and we were able to set this date, and we're glad the time has finally arrived. Cody met with our deacon officers for lunch on Friday, and we had a wonderful time together, wonderful conversation. We're able to let him know a little bit more about our church family and get to know him. As I know you will, we found him to be an insightful and thoughtful, extremely bright and gracious man. Cody's partner, Ben, is a hospital chaplain in Sacramento, California, and unfortunately unable to be with us today. But his parents, Monty and Renee, they will be with us in worship. They're not here for this occasion, but they will be with us in worship. So I hope you'll have an opportunity to meet them. I think grandparents and some other Sanders folks from Duncan also here at the 10:30 service. So please meet them. And thank you, Cody, for being with us. It's a privilege to welcome you to our church family. He's going to speak for a few minutes, and we'll have an opportunity to get some questions and discussion at about 12 minutes after. Even if he's in mid-sentence, I'm going to grab him and take him upstairs to get a robe on and get ready for our service. Cody, glad you're here. Let's give him a welcome.
It is it's a privilege to be here in a church that I grew up admiring and knowing a lot about. So I'm going to start with talking about growing up, and I knew I was different even as a very young child. I was only 5 or 6 years old, but I knew my interests and my proclivities and my tendencies were different from other boys my age. The dreams my friends had for their lives weren't my dreams. My vision of adulthood was a bit askew from the norm of boys my age. And eventually I broke the news to my parents, and then to my peers, and then even to my church. I want to be a church organist. It was a shocking revelation. You probably thought that was going to be a different story. But what I identify as the emergence of my own calling to ministry started very early in my childhood. I was first lured to the church and to Christian faith, not by belief, but by beauty. The music of the church beckoned me. The music of choirs and the organ called me to come closer. As a 5-year-old, I was enamored with choral music and congregational singing, and most especially the pipe organ. I even remember the first time I ever visited First Baptist Church of Greenville. I was probably 12 or 13 years old, and I got my grandparents to bring me here from Duncan for the organ recital of one of Charles Tompkins' organ students from Furman. Another time when I was barely an adolescent, I got my grandfather to drive me over to the church on a weekday during the summer. I knew my mother and father were once friends with Glenn Adkins back in their college days when Glenn was a minister in training at First Baptist Duncan. And he was even in their wedding. So I thought I'd come over and ask him if I can play this grand organ of yours one afternoon. But since we arrived unannounced, Glenn was out for the day, and so the receptionist says we could go and look at the organ if we wanted to. I'm disappointed. But this morning, Judy Snyder redeemed the whole situation, and she let me play the organ when I arrived this morning. So I got that accomplished. And it didn't end there. When I was 6 years old, I started a year-long campaign of persistently begging my father and grandfather to build me my own church in our backyard. And both of them were contractors, and they finally relented and built a small chapel for me in the backyard. I recently, well, I'll tell that in a minute. It was large enough to seat 6 or 8 congregants comfortably, so a rather small congregation. The front wall of the church featured a large stained glass window that we found tucked away in the basement of our real church, just slightly damaged from years of neglect and cracked in just a few places. It was really perfect for my backyard church, bathing the altar in rays of pale blue and purple light. The altar was fashioned from a big old wooden office desk. The roof was adorned with a bright white steeple built by my grandfather. I'd been shopping around town for, the perfect steeple, and pointed out a nearby steeple that served as the model for my own. Outside the door, there was a big bell to ring in the faithful, which usually just included my grandfather and a neighbor friend. My grandmother sewed a tiny robe for my 6-year-old frame, complete with my first ministerial stole, 6 years old. My grandfather would preach while I led music in numerous services each week. It was a very active congregation for me this morning. And once the story of my childhood church ran on the front page of the Spartanburg Herald-Journal, a woman in the neighborhood, and this was an above-the-fold front page, full-color story. I mean, slow news days in Spartanburg back in the 80s. A woman in a neighboring town read the thing, and she contacted us to sell us her old electronic organ that she still had, that she wasn't using anymore, so we bought her organ. And I was reading the Herald Journal story. I found it online. I was looking through it, and the big quote, how they bring out one big quote sort of in the middle, and it was my father saying, I thought it was just a passing phase. Which also sounds similar to another kind of story, But it was during this same period of childhood that I remember first becoming aware of another newly emerging sense. And this was an emerging sense of my attraction to my male peers. And while I didn't know what to make of this as a child, I had heard enough to know that it wasn't looked upon kindly by church and society. So I prayed about this attraction in whatever childhood way I could manage until after some years, and this is really fast forwarding a bit, but after some years the realization emerged for me that my sexuality just wasn't a problem after all. But while I knew myself that it wasn't a problem to be attracted to other men, I also knew that I must keep it a secret. And this secret keeping was for 2 reasons. First, growing up in Duncan, South Carolina, I knew not one single person who identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, which I'll abbreviate as LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. I knew not one other person who identified in that way growing up in Duncan, South Carolina. And it was well after I graduated high school, moved away to college, actually toward the end of my college career, that I ever met anyone who identified as a lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or transgender. And the point of that is that isolation facilitates a great deal of secret keeping about sexuality. And conversely, the secret keeping really facilitates keeping people isolated and alone. Today, a person growing up in Duncan or in Greenville wouldn't experience quite the same degree of isolation to demonstrate how things have changed over the last decade or so. How many of you in this very room know someone in your life, either a family member, a friend, an acquaintance, a coworker, who identifies as lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender? Just by show of hands. I mean, nearly everyone. I mean, if I were sitting in a room like this when I was 17 or 18 years old, I would not have been able to raise my hand. I mean, just a few miles down the road. That's a hopeful sign that isolation is beginning to break down a bit, and people are finding one another and knowing one another face to face. The other reason for my secret keeping, though, was the tension that had become evident between my emerging sense of sexual identity and my sense of call to ministry. By adolescence, I knew very well that the pervasive attitudes of the churches toward LGBT persons, and I knew my own pathway into ministry would be greatly hindered by my coming out. So I kept my secret and proceeded on to service in the ministry of local churches, serving churches in Spindale, North Carolina, and later in Lithonia, Georgia. But when I met Ben at Gardner-Webb University, things started to change for me. We'd been friends for 2 years during college. And we'd never revealed anything to one another about our same-sex attraction that we both experienced. We never said a word about it to anyone, certainly not to each other. Eventually, a campus ministry small group that my roommate and I led in our dorm started to discuss the topic of human sexuality. And that year, I'd also come into leadership in the organization of religion majors on campus, and our group of 5 leaders, 3 of whom came out after college, but none of the 3 of us who worked together, were friends together, saw each other every day, were open with one another about our sense of sexual identity. So the 5 of us put together a forum on sexuality and invited speakers to talk about biblical and social scientific and ministerial perspectives on sexual orientation. Well, since Ben was in my small group and was a religion minor, this drew us into some intense conversations in which it became clear that he thought that I was far too liberal in my views about sexual orientation. So in an effort to convince me that my views were mistaken, he shared with me his story. He had struggled with same-sex attraction since he was very young, coming out to some family members and friends in an effort to seek help. The guidance of his Southern Baptist and later Pentecostal churches was for Ben to enter an ex-gay ministry. You may have heard of these kinds of things. They're places people go to join groups that purport to help make you become straight. And he'd been driving a total of 2 hours every single week from Gardner-Webb to Spartanburg to attend this ex-gay ministry group. It took me a while to come out to Ben, knowing this. But we kept talking, and in our campus ministry small group and in personal conversation and working through the questions we both had about sexuality and Christian faith. After 2 years of friendship, 2 years of friendship and many months of talking over Christian perspectives on same-sex attraction, often in disagreement on the issues, I finally told Ben about my own sexual self-understanding. And the summer after I graduated from college, even though all of our differences of opinion on sexuality and faith hadn't quite been worked out yet, we decided to start a relationship together. And on a first date, befitting a pipe organ playing kid who grew up with a church in his backyard, we had our first romantic outing at the Bob Jones University Museum of Religious Art. It's that type of romance that keeps a couple together for 8.5 years. I mean, I really set the bar high with that first. Since I'm not a part of this congregation, I'm only an outside admirer of this congregation. I cannot speak to what it means for you to enter a process of discernment around your congregation's relationship to LGBT Christians. But if I were helping a church navigate this process of discernment, I would encourage you to begin with this question. What stories and narratives about this particular congregation, First Baptist Church of Greenville, South Carolina, have led you to this place of discernment? Why does it make sense as a question of discernment that you would be asking at this particular time in the life of your congregation? I think those are important and helpful places to begin, because questions like this just don't arise out of nowhere. Our current moment has a history. And what I do know about First Baptist Greenville is that you're a congregation that has not shied away from difficult conversations in the past, and not shied away from taking stands that were unpopular in the larger Baptist world in the past. So while there are a lot of questions to deal with, the one I might suggest dealing with first is why it makes sense for you, for this congregation. What stories, what narratives have led you to this place of discernment now? And I suppose the real question is, what type of community do you aspire to be? But since I'm not an insider here and privy to all those many stories and narratives that animate your life as a congregation, I want to spend a little while reflecting on a perspective I can speak about just a bit. And that is, just what does it mean for a congregation to practice welcome for LGBT people as whole beings into the life of a congregation? What does it mean for LGBT people to experience that kind of welcome in the life of a congregation? First, let me tell you the story of the first congregation ever created with a purposeful welcome and affirmation for gay and lesbian people. There were a few gay members of a particular Catholic parish who were denied participation in the Eucharist again and again as they approached the altar to receive the gifts of bread and cup. Week after week, they were turned away by their priest who had heard their private confessions and refused to allow gay and lesbian people to partake in Holy Communion. It wasn't the first time that gay and lesbian people had been denied access to the table of the Lord, but this time, those excluded by the gatekeepers of the ecclesial status quo mounted a rather audacious and faith-filled response. Renting space in a hotel lounge with a makeshift altar constructed from cocktail tables, this small group of gay Catholics formed a new congregation that eventually took the name the Eucharistic Catholic Church, a reminder of the sacrament once but never again denied them. And if you thought this story took place in the late 1960s or early 1970s in a place like New York or San Francisco, you'd be dead wrong about that. The forming of the first congregation by lesbian and gay Christians, a congregation of gay and straight members, racially integrated and inclusive of people from many denominations, took place in 1946 in Atlanta, Georgia, the heart of the American South. Gay and straight members, racially integrated, multi-denominational, 1946 in Atlanta, Georgia. Impossible, if you ask me. Imagine what it must have taken to move this small group of people to take such a great risk, working without any guarantees to found a racially integrated, multi-denominational, congregation fully inclusive of gay and straight members in the heart of the American South in 1946. I think such a bold risk really illuminates for us what is at stake for LGBT people in search of a faith community that will embrace their whole lives. We often focus a great deal of our conversation on what it will mean for a church to welcome LGBT people into the full life of a congregation, but it is equally important to pay careful attention to what it will mean for LGBT people in your congregation and in your community to enter a worship service knowing that their lives do not have to be fractured into pieces in order to fit, who don't have to be hyper-vigilant about what they say and how much information they reveal about their lives and whether or not they can introduce their partner at a Sunday school gathering without being concerned over whether or not they'll get invited back to another church party. Churches like that are a rare gift to a community. After Ben graduated from Gardner-Webb, a semester behind me, we were both in Atlanta starting seminary together at McAfee School of Theology. We served in ministry together both on our college campus and then later in seminary and local congregations. We were both on ministerial staff at a Southern Baptist church in Lithonia, Georgia. And at least 2 years into our relationship, working together in ministry, going to seminary together, we were still keeping our sexuality and our relationship a secret from others. We knew that our love for one another might put our potential for fulfilling our callings in jeopardy, and in reality, could very well put our lives in jeopardy. But while the church worked to keep us in the closet for a long time, it was a church that also helped us to find freedom from secret keeping and isolation. It was a congregation in Decatur, Georgia, Oakhurst Baptist Church, where we first experienced not only a faith community, but a community of any kind that celebrated our relationship and nurtured our callings and eventually ordained us both into ministry. Think about how unusual that is as a story. As a young gay couple going into ministry, our first place of acceptance wasn't a group of friends that we had met somewhere and been able to be open with. It wasn't a college group. It wasn't a community center. It wasn't a bar or anything. Our first community of any kind that we were able to reveal something of our lives to and that embraced us was a church. And I've heard from many that this is the kind of congregation that First Baptist Greenville is too. A congregation where people feel they really do belong. A place where isolation is met with the embrace of community. A place where secret keeping meets truth telling. And it seems that it is this sense of yourself as a congregation that is leading you into this process of discernment and dialogue to figure out how to better express these commitments that you have cultivated to the community that surrounds you. A community that includes many lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people who, many of whom at least, you already know and care about very much. What I want to offer to close my time before we do some question and answer dialogue is a contribution I've tried to make to this wider conversation on sexuality and faith through my book, Queer Lessons for Churches on the Straight and Narrow. And I hope it might be helpful to you. That is to note the importance of the questions that we ask when entering dialogues like this one. There are two ways we often approach conversations about human difference within faith communities. One we have practiced for a very long time and threatens to become the only way we know how to enter dialogue on difficult concerns. And the other I want to propose as a different way into dialogue. Our traditional strategy for these type of questions has been one of suspicious scrutiny. Christian communities have long been suspicious toward various forms of human difference, whether race or gender or class or gender identity or sexual orientation or religious affiliation. We have preferred and really have perfected a suspicious gaze toward those who differ from the social or congregational norm. These suspicious questions typically go something like this. Can someone be both gay and a faithful Christian? Or how should a congregation respond to gay people? Or should we allow gays and lesbians access to church membership or leadership positions or ordination? Or are gay people excluded from the covenant of marriage based on their same gender-loving status? So these kinds of questions represent a posture of suspicious scrutiny that lead to many ways of investigating the questions we ask about LGBT people. Sometimes we turn to the scriptures and ask, what does the Bible say about homosexuality? Or we turn to historical precedent and ask, can it be any other way? Or we turn to scientific sources as another avenue by which we inquire, how did they get that way, by choice or by nature? All of these strategies continue to avert our gaze away from the lived realities of the subjects of inquiry and instead bolster our suspicion with sources that we can then use to talk about these people. Questions formed out of suspicion toward human difference do produce certain results, but these outcomes typically take the shape of boundary maintenance. For example, can someone be both gay and a faithful Christian? If the answer we arrive upon is no, then we shore up the boundaries of church membership, of ordination, of Christian marriage, and we keep those who do not fit the norm out. If we answer that question yes, then we shift the boundaries outward a little bit to include more people in these institutions. We let some of them in. If we're still unsure, then we just sort of agree that these are the boundaries we have for now and probably for a good reason, and if they need to change, someone else will have to change them some other time. And it's not that questions of inclusion aren't important. There's obviously a lot at stake in these questions for people like Ben and people like me and people like the LGBT people in your community. At times, these questions have led to the opening of inclusive spaces that provide breathing room for LGBT people who desire to practice their faith without scrutiny, to follow their callings without hindrance, to wed their partners in joy, to live their lives in safety. Questions of inclusion can be really important. But we simply cannot rest satisfied when we have settled the questions of inclusion, because in the end they are unimaginative questions with very little life beyond the answer, beyond figuring out where the boundaries lie. They don't move our hearts, they only move our boundaries. They don't provoke our theological imagination, only the rearrangement of our theological beliefs. And too often they fail to get us moving in creative directions, but only serve to get us stuck in a morass of conflicting views. So it is time for us to ask some new questions. So I want to suggest that this strategy of suspicious scrutiny is quickly becoming worn out. And suspicious scrutiny has allowed us to talk about LGBT people without actually talking with LGBT people. It so often serves to dehumanize by making people into objects of inquiry that we can investigate at a distance with the tools of biblical scholarship or scientific study, rather than calling us into relationship with others in dialogue. So this morning I want to suggest another way forward in these discussions at the intersection of sexuality and faith. I suggest that as we begin to shed our suspicious scrutiny toward LGBT people, that we learn to adopt a posture of compassionate curiosity. Compassionate curiosity as a new way forward in this dialogue, opening space for relational involvement and dialogue with others, and not simply debate about others. I don't want you to think that I'm just talking about semantics here. There's a world of difference between suspicion and compassion. And there's a world of difference between scrutiny and curiosity. While suspicion places us in opposition to those we are investigating, compassion places us into human relationship with them. While scrutiny emerges from anxiety and fear in the face of the LGBT other, curiosity emerges from a human-to-human desire to know and to learn from the LGBT other. Questions of suspicious scrutiny too often serve to maintain boundaries and support the status quo, while questions of compassionate curiosity move us toward mutual learning and growth with those who differ from us. These are the kinds of questions I've tried to ask in my book to get this kind of conversation going in some churches for whom the suspicious scrutiny conversations are just wearing thin. So the questions like, what have LGBT people learned about the formation of relationships at the margins of church and society that we would all benefit from knowing? Because we often find ourselves asking, can gay people get married, for instance? But I rarely hear us asking, what do gay and lesbian couples know about how to form intimate bonds, covenanted relationships, lifelong partnerships? What have they learned about that? Living some of them for 30, 40, 50 years in relationship with another person when they have no support from their family or no support from a church or no legal structures to enter into, yet grow these really flourishing relationships. So the compassionately curious question would be, what have they learned that we should all be paying attention to? Another one, what can congregations learn from the example of LGBT people who have cultivated community at the margins of church and society, even amid widespread rejection from so many of their families and communities? And I told you the story of the Eucharistic Catholic Church. But that's just one story among many where LGBT persons couldn't find any community within their city or within the congregations or within any of the established institutions where everyone normally goes to find community. And community was cultivated at the margins, often in ways that saved people's lives. And I've been around churches to know, enough at least, to know that questions about how we form healthy and helpful communities is an important question for congregations. The LGBT people know something about that. What can we learn from the examples of LGBT people who maintain strong faith commitments amid widespread rejection by the churches? I get emails every day with charts and graphs and numbers about the decline of congregations and decline of mainline denominations and the closing of doors. We should be really curious when there's any group of people who's lining up to get into churches. In a time when you're facing great change as a congregation, I would encourage you to also ask some compassionately curious questions about your own lives and your own community here at First Baptist. What kind of congregation do we aspire to become in relation to LGBT people in our church and in our community? This is not a question of simply what you should think about LGBT people or gay marriage or any other issue. It's a question about what kind of community you aspire to be. It's a question about how you want your LGBT congregants and your neighbors in the community to experience this church when they enter into a worship service or a Sunday school class. It's a question about how you live out the identity you have formed for yourself as a congregation over the years. Asking how you, as a church, continue to faithfully live out those aspects of your congregation's identity in relation now to your LGBTQ siblings in this faith community. What kind of community do you aspire to be? Thank you.